Class, welcome to week 4 of Kin 264. This week you will have a chance to review everything we've covered so far and also observe how the muscular actions work during exercises. Hopefully this will help you to start working on your critical assignment and also analyzing upper and lower body movements. This week you'll also work on your third cap, and you also have your midterm exam, which consists of 50 questions. Not all separate questions. Some of them are um, relate to one another and may have figures where you have to um, identify certain anatomical structures. So you'll have multiple choice, true, false, landmark identification, and fill in the blank. Here's a brief breakdown of what to expect on the midterm. So a lot of the questions are regarding anatomical landmarks, prime movers, innervation, and then also plane of motion. And the numbers in parentheses are approximate numbers of how many questions of each of those subjects you'll find on the midterm. And I can tell you that the midterm is set up just like the way the quizzes are. So you'll have, similar questions. Some of the questions maybe even from the quizzes you've already taken. So if you can review those, I think that'll be very helpful. So this week in chapter 12, it covers muscular analysis, and one of the first concepts that you'll read about is the kinetic chain, and it's a term that's been used for decades, and it was meant to remind healthcare practitioners to look outside the joint, muscle, or bone, or specific structures that are affected and that they're treating, so as to not miss any outside factors that could be contributing to factors and factors that create the dysfunctions and injuries that aren't apparent on initial evaluations. So, for example, in this illustration, the overpronation of someone's ankle, as shown here, down here, can produce issues at the knee, hip, spine, and even the neck. The evaluation process will differ slightly amongst healthcare professionals, such as PTs, ATs, personal trainers, even PE teachers, because of the populations that they work with, but the understanding that the musculature and the biomechanical composition throughout the human body is interrelated will be beneficial to each of these practitioners. From personal experience, I can tell you that things such as overpronation at the ankle can create a lot of problems at the knee, and something as simple as using a different shoe insert can fix a lot of problems that may be creating tendonitis at the knee or on the shin. And I don't work a lot with chronic movement athletes, but the ones that I have worked with, sometimes the low back issues that a lot of athletes deal with will stem from issues at the knee or the ankle. And as soon as we address those issues, we start to see relief of back pain and even issues at the neck as well. Next, we have the open kinetic and closed kinetic chain, which refers to the movement of the body under different circumstances. Open kinetic chain movements or exercises require that movement of the limbs occur in space, whereas the closed kinetic chain exercises require keeping the limbs on the ground. For example, knee flexion can occur with your feet on the ground or with feet off the ground. This first picture shows a full squat where the person is fully flexing the knee. You'll notice that the person is weight bearing and both feet are on the ground. If you did this on a single leg, it would still be a closed kinetic chain movement, so that both knee flexion and extension would be done in a closed kinetic chain manner. The second picture, however, with Usain Bolt sprinting, also shows the right leg in full flexion. However, his leg is in air and space. It's not weight bearing, but it's still flexing. This would be considered an open kinetic chain movement. So these two examples kind of show you the difference and the importance of this, at least in rehabilitation, is when prescribing exercises. Closed kinetic chain exercises typically precede open kinetic chain exercises because there's less torsion and shear on the joints. Anytime you're moving joints in space without any contact with the ground, there's a lot more chance for valgus, varus forces, torsion, and shear. Here's a short clip explaining this concept even a little bit further.
In closed kinetic chain movements, the distal ends of the limb, that is the hands and the feet, are in a fixed position, emphasizing joint compression as your limbs push and pull against a stable force or object, making the joint more stable. As Jessie demonstrates in her push-up, you will notice that her hands and feet are fixed against the stable surface as she pushes against the ground. In open chain kinetic movements, the distal ends are now moving freely as the exercise is performed. This creates more shearing forces at the joints, very similar to a pair of scissors cutting through paper, where each shear is moving in opposite direction as force acts upon that paper.
Next, we have the overload principle, and this concept is meant to guide safe progression of muscle and joint function. Within appropriate parameters, muscles can increase strength by the amount of overload placed on them. This is an illustration of Milos of Croton, who was a Greek wrestler. He is said to have carried a bull on his shoulders from the time it was a calf until it was a full-grown bull. And this is meant to exemplify how gradual progression of overload can produce great outcomes over time. So, as you can see here, as a young boy, he would carry the calf, and as it got bigger, he kept carrying it. So slowly it increased the overload placed on him, and as the bull got bigger, he got stronger. And the same principles can apply with rehabilitation and strength training. Currently, we can be more specific about how this progression takes place by controlling the frequency, intensity, and duration. Frequency referring to number of times per week, so how many times a week you're going to do an exercise. The intensity referring to the percentage of the absolute maximum effort. And then finally the duration, the number of minutes per exercise. So we can manipulate each of these parameters to control how we apply this overload principle in either, if we're more of a strength and conditioning setting, we can control how we train our athletes. And if we're in more of the rehabilitation setting, such as a physical therapist or athletic trainer, then we can modify the exercises with these parameters so that we can slowly return an athlete back to play. Finally, this next principle of specific adaptations to impose demands, or the SAID principle, works along the same vein as the overload principle. However, with the SAID principle, we are referring to specificity. So, how you train will determine how you perform in your individual activity. For that matter, how you rehabilitate will determine how you return to play, or we should say that the sport of the athlete should determine how the training should take course. Although all of these athletes will benefit from a strength training regimen, that regimen will look differently based on muscle groups used and length of training. For example, a training program for an MLB pitcher will need to address the power required from the abdominals, latissimus dorsi, the pectoralis group, and rotator cuff muscles to produce the pitching motion over a full season, whereas a long distance runner will focus on the muscular endurance of the erector spinae, abdominals, the rhomboids, and shoulder external rotators to maintain proper posture during running dozens of miles at a time. And the same goes for all of these other athletes, where they're going to need similar types of exercises and training, but the way you implement the training program will differ from athlete to athlete. And that's where we kind of get into specificity. Anytime we're doing any kind of strength training, any kind of just performance training, it has to be specific to the demands of what our athletes need. And that's all I have for you guys this week. If you have questions, if you still are not too sure about anything that's due this week, I guess the main concern would be the midterm. Please reach out to me. I'll try to answer as best as I can and give you as much help as possible. Thank you guys. Have a great week, and I will see you next week.